Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I have another review of a Niall Marsh Roderick Allen novel. This time it's Deadwater, celebrating its 60th anniversary in 2024. And I've said this before, but Deadwater is a book that just doesn't stick with me. I never remember anything that ever happens in this book. And it's very strange because I always remember the plots of books, the main plot points, the murderer, the victim, the method, the basic plot. I just never can do that with this novel. And I even recently watched the adaptation of this book for a previous video, and I still didn't remember anything that happened. And that's why I chose to review Deadwater over Black as He's Painted, which is another Niall Marsh novel celebrating an anniversary this year. I won't have time to cover it. And I will say, this book is good. It's not like top tier by any means. I can see why I forget about it all the time, but it's perfectly fine. There's nothing that really stands out to me, but I'll get into it. As a reminder, I will give a spoiler free summary of this novel up until the point of the murderer reveal, at which case I will let you know it's coming, and you can back out if you don't want to be spoiled. From that point forward, spoilers are fair game. So before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. Deadwater begins with a short prologue following Wally Traherne. Wally is a young boy teased by the other children for the warts on his hand. They point and laugh at him and call him the warty hog. His parents are terrible. His mother is a drunk. His father just doesn't care. Wally is basically all alone. One day he visits Pixie Falls on his hometown island of Port Caro, which is again on the island of the same name. He dips his hands into the spring water and sees a vision of a woman in green called the Green Lady or the Green Fairy. The next day, Wally's warts are gone, and this miracle is attributed to the water of Pixie Spring. Jenny Williams is Wally's teacher and really the only person who cares for him. She's young and from New Zealand. I personally got the sense Niall Marsh inserted a little bit of her young self in Jenny here. Jenny is really the most positively depicted one time character in this novel. Jenny is disappointed in Wally's parents for not even really caring about this miracle. The same day Wally is cured, a bunch of townspeople discuss the event at the local inn called the Boy and Lobster, which is a fantastic name. Major Barrymore is the owner of the inn, and his wife and stepson is Patrick Ferrier. They don't know what to think about it all. Elspeth Cost is the local shopkeeper, and she is all in on this miracle because she says Pixie Spring cured her asthma. Dr. Main doesn't believe it at all, which is very clear. He's worried about his business if people start seeking mythological cures instead of visiting him. The Reverend Carstairs is conflicted. He believes in miracles, as a man of the cloth, but he doesn't think this is the right kind of miracle. Also at the Boy and Lobster is Kenneth Joyce, who goes by KJ. He's a reporter and wants to do a story on the spring. And the people present are also conflicted about this, if they should keep it a secret or should they tell the public. Elspeth Cost and Major Barrymore very clearly see dollar signs, or pound signs, I guess I should say, as this is in England, while most of the others are a little worried about all this. Prologue ends and we skip ahead 2 years in time. Inspector Allen is meeting with his old French teacher, Miss Emily Pride, who is elderly and extremely stuffy. They converse in French, and Miss Pride still critiques Allen's accent and the things he says. She calls him Roderick, but she wants some advice from him. She recently inherited her sister's property. Her sister's named Fanny Winterbottom, which is another spectacular name, and it won't be the last one either. Miss Pride is now the owner of Port Caro, which I think might just be a cultural thing. I just don't grasp being, an American in 2024. Miss Pride says she owns the town, which I did understand, but how I interpreted this is that she owns the land and the people who live and work there rent from her. That makes more sense. I mean, to me, it wasn't really clear, though I think if you were living in England in 1964, it might be. The only thing I remembered from this book, from the previous times I read it, was that she owned the town. But anyway, she gets furious with Port Caro because her sister and the townspeople went all in on commercializing Pixie Springs. Port Caro has grown to accommodate all of these visitors who stay at the Boy and Lobster and shop at Elspeth Cost's store, and they visit the spring hoping to cure their ailments. Miss Pride wrote to Major Barrymore and Elspeth Cost, telling them to stop this, and she plans on using her power as owner and landlord to stop this. She receives a number of death threats in response, so she asks Alan what she should do. And he tells her, basically that she shouldn't go to Port Carroll like she wants to because it's very clearly dangerous for her, but she won't listen to that. I mean, really, she gets nothing out of Alan, and I'm not sure what, she did want from him in the first place. Very clearly, he was going to say, don't go, and clearly she was going to go anyway. Back in Port Caro, Jenny has returned to the island. During the time skip, she achieved her dream job of teaching English in Paris, and now she's back in Port Caro on a break. Patrick, whom she is still smitten with, picks her up and warns her that she's going to be horrified at what's become of the island in her absence. And Patrick's correct. Jenny is disgusted when she sees all the tourists just teeming about the place and how much Port Caro has changed for the worse because of the quote unquote miraculous Pixie Spring. Everyone with a terminal illness is coming to be cured. Although Patrick says no one actually has been cured, people leave there just as sick as they were when they came. The Barrymores still own the Boy and Lobster, but it's no longer this pub and a fishing village. It's much grander and nicer and more expensive. Miss Cost no longer has her old shop, but she has since opened a very tacky gift shop selling all kinds of spring-related knickknacks, especially around the Green Lady, who allegedly appeared to Wally in the spring. Dr. Main's practice is booming because all of those sick people who didn't get healed in the spring check in with him to get treatment. Reverend Carstairs, who still claims to be anti-spring, isn't complaining about all the donations to the church's renovation fund. There's also a mayor now, and his name is Ives Nankyvel, another A-plus name. Mayor Nankyvel is a complete moron, and we don't get a lot of background on how he became mayor, but it's pretty clear to me the citizens picked the dumbest person for the job because he wouldn't get in the way. He reminded me a lot of the mayor of Cabot Cove on Murder, She Wrote. Most horrifying to Jenny, however, is her former student Wally, who is very clearly being exploited by both his parents and the townspeople to make money. They've basically elevated Wally to godlike status, and they force him to do all of these things. He's basically a tourist attraction unto himself. These townspeople discuss what they're going to do with Miss Pride when she shows up, and they don't come up with any real plan other than to just say whatever they will to get her out of Port Caro and their hair as quickly as possible. They also discuss the possibility of buying the island from Miss Pride, although no one thinks she will actually sell it. Miss Pride shows up, and she's as sour as she always is. She's very rude to people like Patrick, who try to help her in and out of the boat and up the stairs. Miss Pride reminds me a lot of both of my grandmothers, who always refused to help. Both my grandmothers had issues walking, but they would insist on walking upstairs and not using an elevator, and they would refuse help. And to see them in Miss Pride, although both my grandmothers were a lot nicer people. Major Barrymore tries to bribe her with the free room, but she insists on paying, and she doesn't want to socialize with anyone. She does take a liking to Jenny, however, which makes a lot of sense since Jenny is also a teacher, an outsider to Port Caro, and her French accent is much better than Inspector Allen's. Miss Pride is very proud of that accent. Miss Pride explores the island, and she's even more horrified than Jenny was. And what really bothers her, in addition, to everything else, is this new gate that's been put around the spring. You could once visit the spring for free. You could just walk there and go. But now there's a gate and a turnstile, and you have to purchase tokens from Major Barrymore or his wife to gain access to the spring. Major Barrymore did offer to give them to Miss Pride for free, but again, she insisted on paying. Miss Pride just horrified by all of this. It's one thing to have a gift shop and an expensive inn, but then to be charging for access to the healing spring is really gross to her. Especially since when she does go to the spring, she sees a woman dipping her sick baby in the water, and that's sort of the final straw for her. Miss Pride really can't take this exploitation of the sick any longer, and she visits Miss Cost at her shop and threatens her. She tells Miss Cost that she will not renew her lease for her gift shop unless she stops selling all of these Green Lady items and stops promoting the spring. Naturally, Miss Cost does not take this well, And all of that appeasement of Miss Pride's, goes out of the window. Miss Cost screams at her. She calls her evil, and she's not shutting down the shop, and she's not calling off the anniversary parade either. Miss Pride does give in somewhat and allows the parade and the festival, but she doesn't give up on the gift shop lease. Miss Costa then goes into an asthma attack, and Miss Pride basically laughs at her, as she's wheezing to death because she claimed the spring healed her asthma. Very clearly, that wasn't true. Miss Costa insists she's not having an attack, even though she's like wheezing and can barely speak. And what do you know? Shortly afterwards, Miss Pride is attacked. She was sitting on a ledge outside the hotel when someone threw a rock at her, which caused her to fall and slide down the ledge. She's basically uninjured, but the death threats keep coming, and she doesn't want to see anyone but Jenny, and because she knows someone is trying to kill her, and she trusts Jenny. Meanwhile, Inspector Coombe is the local police detective, and as a favor to Alan, he was watching over Miss Pride. He actually put a Sergeant Pender on her trail, and he calls Alan on vacation to update him. Alan is worried about Miss Pride. Very clearly, she's in danger, and he calls her on the phone. Miss Pride insists that she is not in danger, and there's no need for him to give up his vacation to come babysit her. But naturally, Alan does do that, much to his wife's chagrin. Troy is not happy with Alan doing this, and that gets mentioned a lot in this book. The reason why is because while he was on the phone with her, Miss Pride found yet another death threat, and this one attached to a Green Lady figurine. She's pretty resolute in her belief that her assailant is Miss Cost for various reasons, not least of which is that someone threatened her over the phone while everyone else it could have been was sitting with Miss Pride. Miss Pride does lack a bit of discretion. I think like when you see these like elderly spinster people who are wise, you immediately think of Miss Marple, but Miss Marple, wouldn't make an accusation like Miss Pride does. Miss Pride, she's like, yeah, it's Miss Cost, that's it, no discussion. Miss Marple wouldn't be like that. The day of the festival arrives, and Marsh describes this scene so wonderfully. I know she has a tendency to over describe, but in this book, she does it the right amount. There are all these people in green, and they're wearing green cheesecloth, and everyone in Port Caro is there. Wally is supposed to give this recital of a poem Miss Cost wrote, but he bungles it very badly because, he's simply not cut out for this sort of thing. He's just being exploited. And Miss Pride attempts to interrupt the festival, but when she does so, it begins pouring rain and thundering, and everybody just stampedes off to stay dry. Alan is there by this point, and she angrily rebuffs his assistance because she has an umbrella and she's fine. She doesn't need any help. The rest of the festival is canceled. Miss Cost is a total wreck. But anyway, back at the Boy and Lobster, Miss Pride confides in Alan that she knows Miss Cost is the one behind the threats and the attack on her life, but she thinks Wally Traherne threw the rock at her and that he was tricked and manipulated into doing so by Miss Cost. Miss Cost exerts a lot of control over Wally, who has become this very horrible child, yet another terrible child in a mystery novel. Wally's become very spoiled because of his newfound celebrity status, and his parents, especially his father, encourage this attitude. Alan convinces Miss Pride to leave Port Caro the next day, and she finally agrees. And this is a fun scene because the narration is not clear, but my interpretation of this is that she was always going to leave that day anyway, and she just lets Alan think he convinced her. She also promises not to leave her room that night. The next day, Alan returns to Port Caro. He wasn't staying on the island because the Boy and Lobster was at capacity. He passes by Pixie Spring and notices a note posted from Miss Pride saying that the railing and the grating has to be taken down in 2 days and the commercialization must also end. There's also a muddy note on the ground that says the same thing. More interestingly, however, is the dead body of a woman floating in the springs. Alan can't get into the spring to help her because he doesn't have an entry disc, so he has to break down the turnstile. The woman was face down, and there was a black umbrella next to her, which made Alan think this was Miss Pride, but when he gets to the body, it's actually Miss Cost. And she was murdered. She was hit on the back of her head with what Alan suspects is a stone from nearby. He fetches Inspector Coombe, and it becomes apparent very quickly the prime suspect is Wally Traherne. When Dr. Main comes to examine the body, he says he was out and up early because he had to deliver a baby, and when he was coming home, he saw Wally follow Miss Pride, with the implication being that Wally mistook Miss Cost for Miss Pride along the way. When Alan asks Miss Pride about this, she also says she saw Wally, and this is a really funny bit because in the midst of this like dawning murder investigation, Alan scolds Miss Pride for leaving her room because she had promised not to, but she said she promised she wouldn't leave her room at night, but she left the next morning. Instead of returning to London, Miss Pride is going to stay in Portcarrow. She's going to leave Portcarrow, but she's going to be staying nearby. Alan asks Jenny to accompany him to the Trahernes because Wally is much more likely to speak to Jenny than to Alan. And pretty much everybody, including Jenny, thinks Wally did it. Jenny agrees to go, but she doesn't want to, and she doesn't want to help incriminate Wally. Wally is pretty terrible, honestly, but the fame of being this child healed by the spring, it really went to his head, and he's become this snotty brat. He's rude to everyone, and his behavior is encouraged by his father, who exploits it to no end for financial gain. Wally is rude to both Alan and Jenny. I mean, earlier in the novel, he didn't even remember who Jenny was, the only person who cared about him when he had warts. And now he does remember her, but calls her that woman who visited him at school once. Wally basically admits, yeah, he was out following Miss Pride, and he hates her because he was trying to shut down the festival in the spring, basically saying that she should have been murdered, but Alan doesn't get anything like useful out of him. However, he does notice the clothesline in the Traherne backyard matches a tripwire from one of the traps used against Miss Pride. Alan isn't really as adamant against Wally as everyone else is. I mean, the reason is that the murderer needed to use a disc to enter the spring, and Wally didn't have a disc, and there's no way in otherwise, because Alan had to force the gate open, and it took him a while to do so. How Alan knew Wally didn't have a disc or couldn't get one is not stated, so that's a bit of a plot hole here. There are a few of these, like, not big plot holes, but noticeable ones at least. Now solo, Alan visits the Carstairs. Because the murder took place on Sunday morning, the Reverend Carstairs and his wife Dulcie were at church, although Dulcie casually throws out that her husband did leave between the masses. Reverend Carstairs tries to push Alan that he was never believed in the healing powers of the spring, and he doesn't like what people are doing, and this falls very flat and unconvincing. Mrs. Carstairs provides some new information. She's very gossipy, as Reverend's wives tend to be. Miss Cost attended the early service at which Miss Carstairs complained to her about losing a necklace Miss Cost borrowed from her. She lost it in the stampede at the festival, and she said she would return to the spring to look for it. This is when she must have been murdered, as Alan found a necklace next to her body. Alan has been wondering about a certain thing no one ever seems to wonder about, and that is when Wally's warts were healed, he claimed he saw a green lady in the spring who spoke to him. This green lady is now everywhere in town. She's the sort of mascot of Portcarrow and Pixie Springs. But she must have been a real person, because Wally of 2 years past wouldn't have made that up. He would have been telling the truth. So Alan is wondering who that woman was. Well, he's not actually wondering because he knows it's Mrs. Barrymore. That would be the wife of Major Barrymore, who runs the Boy and Lobster. She matches the physical description Wally gave, and she had an angry look on her face when the actresses playing the Green Lady at the festival, as if she were perturbed by the scene in a personal way. Mrs. Barrymore admits she is the Green Lady. She gave the dress she wore that day to Mrs. Carstairs to get rid of it. She asks Alan not to tell her husband that he knows the truth. But Major Barrymore is very aware that his wife is the Green Lady, but he doesn't want that getting out because he's used the Green Lady for his own gain. The Barrymores put in all their money into the Boy and Lobster, so they cannot risk Miss Pride shutting things down because all their customers are sick people who want to visit the springs. If that stops, they lose their business, they lose their lives, they lose all their money. And there's some minor bickering going on here between Jenny and Patrick over how close Jenny has gotten to Miss Pride and how she's going to stay with Miss Pride when she leaves. But this is all overshadowed by the arrival of Fox, Bailey, and Thompson to Portcarrow. They don't really provide any big plot points in this novel, although Fox is delightful, as he always is. What they do, though, is free Alan up so he doesn't have to do all the grudge work. He pays a visit to Mayor Nankivel, who tries to be subtle, but he's not, when he tells Alan that Miss Cost, how should I put this delicately, was very horny. If you thought you were going to get through a Niall Marsh novel without a sexually frustrated spinster, you would be incorrect. Miss Cost was obsessed with sex, and she's very reminiscent to me of Miss Idris and Miss Campanella from Overture to Death, which also makes her a Dorothy Sayers parody. More on that in the character section. She was so prudish about sex despite her actions that she had the grating installed around the spring to prevent couples from having sex there, because that was apparently a very popular activity to do in the springs. Anyway, he says Miss Cost basically threw herself at him, but he turned her down. She also tried to swoon over the Reverend Carstairs, who also turned her down, and Major Barrymore, who did not turn her down. Alan basically already had this all figured out, as Major Barrymore, sort of admitted to having a very brief affair with Miss Cost and was horrified by what he did, but, that didn't stop him from collaborating with her and trying to intimidate Miss Pride. Barrymore was also, in on it for obvious reasons. Alan returns to the Trehernes, where Mr. Treherne is really in rare form, probably drunk, and just rambles on about how Wally wasn't out that morning when Miss Cost was murdered, but then he was, but he couldn't have done it because he wasn't out. Mr. Treherne here is engaging in a logical fallacy called kettle logic, where you provide more evidence to support your case rather than good evidence to support your case, and you wind up contradicting yourself. Naturally, this makes Alan extremely suspicious. Treherne doesn't really make any sense. At one point, he threatens Wally with a spanking, which Alan takes as just simple intimidation tactic to keep Wally from saying that he actually was out that morning. Alan asked Mr. Treherne about his clocks because he noticed they were 30 minutes off, and that could provide some explanation for why Treherne's timeline isn't adding up, especially since he had claimed not to have seen Dr. Main out when he really should have. Fox and Company investigate the spring, and they find a bunch of footprints behind a rock. Now, because it rained and everyone was sort of trampling over everything, this isn't exactly helpful, but behind this big rock, it's very clear someone was hiding there recently. And this is where we get into another bit of a plot hole. It's not a big one here, but Alan speculates again that Wally actually did have a disc to get in, though he previously said that was impossible. And then he speculates Wally broke into the gate, even though he said that was also impossible. Also, Alan himself had to break into the spring with considerable force, but then he notices the gate was broken into already. It's not clear, nor does it make sense, but it's not that big of a deal necessarily. You don't need to figure this out to solve it. Inspector Coombe had been working with Fox in Miss Cost's store, searching through her documents. Alan has been pretty convinced Miss Cost was the target all along, and the murderer did not mistake her for Miss Pride. That Miss Cost was the intended victim all along. And, the paperwork does hold some clues as to why and to who. And it does this, so this is where I let you know. Spoilers are coming, so back out now if you need to. You've been warned. Spoilers are fair game coming up. There's all kinds of papers Miss Cost wrote about how evil Miss Pride is, about the spring, and how it didn't really heal her problems, although she sort of pretends like it did, which we already knew from her behavior. Alan finds what he's looking for, but this thought is interrupted by a phone call from the Boy and Lobster, which is itself interrupted by a big scream and a commotion. Alan runs to the Boy and Lobster, where Major Barrymore and Dr. Main are in the middle of fisticuffs. Dr. Main has punched Major Barrymore in the face. Alan gets everyone to calm down, and since everyone is important, he's already at the Boy and Lobster. Why not have a summation gathering? And this is a particularly dramatic one because of the storm breaks out and it's raining and it's heavily raining and it's dark. It's actually very good. It's dramatic without going off the rails here. Okay, it goes off the rails a teeny bit toward the end, but Major Barrymore and Dr. Main refuse to discuss what they were fighting over, but Alan already knows. Dr. Main was having an affair with Mrs. Barrymore. Alan had alluded to this earlier, and Mrs. Barrymore was very coy about it. Traherne was correct in that he didn't see Dr. Main when he should have been passing by, because after delivering the baby, he went to meet Mrs. Barrymore somewhere in secret. Miss Cost knew about this affair and wrote about it in her book, which is why Dr. Main killed her. Alan isn't entirely sure what exactly happened, but he does piece some things together. After Miss Cost was humiliated at the festival with everyone, basically laughing and making a joke of her after she was dripping green ink in the water and whatever, she sort of snapped and wanted revenge. She was basically hanging on by a thread because she was also extremely upset about all the things Miss Pride was doing. She threatened to reveal Dr. Main's affair with Mrs. Barrymore and confronted the doctor about it. He decided to murder her to protect Mrs. Barrymore, and it's also implied, but not directly stated, that he was trying to protect other people from Miss Cost's wrath as well. Miss Cost was clearly going to expose other people's secrets as well. Miss Cost had caught on to Dr. Main and Mrs. Barrymore. She had actually walked in on them in flagrante delicto in the spring once. That's why the gating went up. That's also how Mrs. Barrymore became the Green Lady, because she was there with Dr. Main at the time while he went to heal his warts. That's what they were doing. That's why she was in the spring. There's not much, to the how this was done. Dr. Main delivered the baby when he said he did. Then he met with Mrs. Barrymore, and then he went to kill Miss Cost. He knew she'd be at the spring because he heard all about that necklace stuff from Mrs. Carstairs. Instead of explaining himself, Dr. Main runs out of the Boy and Lobster and dies when he falls slash jumps off a cliff. We're actually told this, a bit backwards. We're told Alan chased after an unnamed murderer, and we don't learn who this is until the epilogue when Alan wakes up from a concussion from the same incident. And just to wrap up here, Miss Pride feels extremely remorseful because she blames her actions for Miss Cost losing her composure on herself. And it seems she may lighten up a bit in regards to Porcaro. It's not clear exactly what she intends, but she no longer feels as strongly against it as she did. Mrs. Barrymore isn't really upset that her lover committed suicide slash died in an accident and murdered to protect her. She just doesn't care. Jenny and Patrick get engaged, and Inspector Fox wants to take French lessons from Miss Pride, and she would be honored to do so because Fox's accent is even worse than Alan's, and so continues on the long-running joke of Inspector Fox trying to learn French and across these 32 novels. The end. All right, let's get into some praise here. This book does a lot well, but like I said, it doesn't do a lot extraordinary well. I really enjoyed this tension between the villagers and Miss Pride over the springs. There are places in England and elsewhere that believe in the healing powers of certain bodies of water, and they often get exploited. I really enjoyed both the debate and the tension over this in Dead Water. Marge is usually extremely opinionated and dismissive of opposing opinions, and it's very clear here she sides with Miss Pride. She doesn't dismiss the villagers either. They don't get the most flattering depiction, but their views come through and are treated somewhat sympathetically, and they get roughly even time. Miss Pride understands, what she's doing when she shuts down the springs. She knows she's hurting the economy and these people's livelihood. She gets it, and we do see her sort of, relent at times. She does allow the parade to go on, and she gives them time to sort everything out. And, by the end, she sort of eases up a little bit. It's not clear what she's going to do. And Marsh is very careful to only criticize the people exploiting other people for financial gain. She goes to great length not to call people who hope to be healed stupid, even though she's pushing this narrative the waters are not miraculous. She depicts sick patients as hopeful and desperate. The ire is thrown at people like Major Barrymore and the mayor. I think the villagers of Porcaro are well depicted. This is a bit more of an ensemble cast rather than Marsh having one or two major one-time characters, so it's a bit unusual here. And I think Miss Pride is a fantastic character, one of Niall Marsh's best one-time characters. I think the mystery itself is fine. There's not a lot of clues or a big shocking moment or anything. I don't want to say run of the mill, but it's perfectly fine. There's nothing spectacular about it. And because there aren't a lot of bells and whistles, that also limits the opportunity for things to go wrong. And there are little moments I enjoyed here. I enjoyed the passage, the chapter that had the festival and the parade. I thought that was very well depicted. And the scene of Miss Cost just like standing there soaking wet and dripping green dye and just feeling humiliated and desperate was really well drawn. I like these little moments of like Miss Pride scolding Alan and Fox for their poor French, Troy complaining about Alan abandoning her on vacation. There are a lot of those sort of moments, but they are present. And the setting is well depicted. I feel like I know exactly what Port Carroll looks like and how it's run. It honestly felt very much like Cabot Cove. And of course, this is pre Cabot Cove. Again, I don't have a lot of praise here, it's like specific praise, but my feelings of this book did improve. When I ranked every Allen novel, I put Deadwater at number 23 of 32, and that was largely because I didn't remember it. I would definitely move it up a few spots at least, not too high, probably to like number 19, I guess. That's still below, the midpoint, but is a much better position. I think more accurately reflects how I feel about this book. And I do have some critiques of this book, especially, because I'm very good at retaining knowledge about the books I've read, especially from A Queen of Crime. The fact that this book continues to fall out of my mind is a pretty bad sign for it. It doesn't have any staying power. I don't think this book is very influential to the mystery genre. I don't even think it's important to like the Allen canon as a whole. There's an argument this is Niall Marsh's most forgettable and least important novel. I did remember, the victim was drowned in the spring and that it wasn't Miss Pride. But I did not remember who the victim even was. Although I did remember roughly halfway there. I didn't remember who the murderer was. I didn't even remember that character existed. I didn't remember any of the characters besides Miss Pride, Miss Gost, and Wally. I did remember them, and I did vaguely remember there was like an inn. I pointed some of them out, but this book has a few plot holes and contradicts itself. This happens multiple times, never detrimentally, but still enough. Niall Marsh is better than that. We're told Wally didn't have a token to enter the springs and that he couldn't have broken in through the gate, but then the springs were broken into and he might have had a token, or maybe he did and he didn't need it. It's all like minor and it clears itself up, but still, it's an error. And there's a lot of tracking down of like the tripwire from the clothesline that wasn't interesting. It's a bit convenient. Alan didn't look through Miss Cost's papers earlier. Very clearly the arrival of Fox and Company had to be delayed to hold off that search from happening earlier. I should also say this book is barely talked about in scholarly research into Niall Marsh. We don't know a lot of what she was thinking in regards to this novel. We do know she probably didn't care much about it or didn't give much thought to it because she was writing this while working on an adaptation of the play Henry IV Part 1, and she was putting that on, and she was much more attentive to that than to this book. Very typical of Niall Marsh to care more about Shakespeare. And also, before she died, Niall Marsh burned all of her papers. So, again, we don't really know what she was thinking a lot of times. We don't have any, like, scholarly work on this novel. And you can feel Niall Marsh didn't give this her all here. And this doesn't feel like anything special. The reviews at the time are basically in line with my opinion that this book is fine. It's not superb. That was the universal opinion of 1964 literary critics and is also the opinion of 2024 YouTube channels. All right, let's talk about characters, starting with Roderick Allen, who was fine here. Again, I think you can very much tell Niall Marsh wasn't giving this book her full attention with Allen. He has some fun moments. I liked his interactions with Miss Pride as the former pupil who, now has to be stern with his former teacher, but the respect is still there, and he doesn't push too hard. He's constantly threatening to arrest her for her own safety. He had some fun interactions with like Fox and Bailey and Troy, but not nearly enough. The other main recurring characters are barely in this book, and it's a shame because I think the lack of them subdued Alan a bit. I did still find him vibrant and intelligent and sharp and interesting, but I felt there was more to give here. I did find the investigation portions fun, and this isn't a lot of like deducting going on here, but we are privy to his internal thoughts, and they were mainly very sarcastic. He doesn't really like any of the people in Port Caro. I found him fine, but there was a missed potential here. But there was good Alan content. It's just a bit different than normal and a bit lacking because we didn't really have like Fox to play off for most of the novel. Dr. Main is our murderer, and I thought he was a decent murderer. Not superb, but not bad either. I always find it interesting when the murderer is actively involved in the police investigation, as Dr. Main is, at least initially. I thought he did an excellent job of like establishing his alibi and aiding the investigation without actually lying about things. He did deliver the baby. He did do the things he said he did. He's not guiding Alan down the wrong path necessarily. I mean, there's a mistake a lot of murderers make there. They try to lure the detective in a certain direction, and Dr. Main sort of leaves Alan alone. I did not find him the most riveting character in the novel. I think a murderer should spark more, and there is like some, dimension to him. Like he tries to portray himself as chivalrous, like he murders Miss Cost to protect Mrs. Barrymore and these other people from being blackmailed and humiliated. I don't know if I really believe that. Again, you can just say he's evil and he murdered her because he was being blackmailed. We didn't see him enough for me to like really make up my mind there. I think because he's like one of the initial holdouts on like should we commercialize this spring that we're supposed to think he's good. Again, I mean you can definitely interpret it either way. On the one front, I think Dr. Main flops because he's just not that interesting, but he was a fine murderer. I mean, there was some dimension to him, like I said. I don't have any like major issues to him. I just think Niall Marsh has a lot better murderer characters. Our victim, Miss Cost, however, was a fantastic character. I mean, she's the typical, like, sexually frustrated spinster that's as much a type to Niall Marsh. She created that a lot. It's like her version of Christie's, retired military man. Miss Cost is very reminiscent of, like, Miss Idris and Miss Campanella from Overture to Death, who were rather mean caricatures of Dorothy Sayers. So that means, Miss Cost is as well. And there's other similarities between certain characters and Miss Cost. Again, I don't want to spoil other books, but again, there's a lot more in common here. I also, couldn't imagine this might have been Niall Marsh mocking herself as well. I mean, Niall Marsh never married, and her personal life was kept under wraps for the most part. I mean, there was a rumor she was a lesbian, and but she did have a male fiance, but he died in World War I, and she sort of like never had romance again. It's sort of like the story that's believed now. Again, we don't know a lot about her personal life, but it's almost as if Niall Marsh purposely gave Miss Cost like complete opposite views of herself. It's like a complete different personality. It's almost too different that it was almost intentional. But I love Miss Cost as a character. She's not likable, but she is well drawn. And I think she's one of the more nuanced personalities in this book. She loves the Springs, and she knows the Springs don't have healing powers. Like her asthma did not disappear, no matter how hard she tries to prove it. And she knows it. She's not delusional. She's lying for the sake of her business. But there's also these other parts to her. She's a woman whose life has not gone well, and she feels like she deserves something. So she has no qualms about lying to people and threatening to people. I think she was a good character. I loved how you never really knew what she was thinking. Is she serious? Is she a liar? I love these characters who snap. She broke. And it's unusual to see that character as a victim. Usually they're the murderer. And I think Miss Cost is one of the best one-time characters in this book outside of Miss Pride. I do think Miss Pride is probably a little better of a character. But still, Miss Cost, fantastic. And speaking of Miss Pride, let's talk about her. Fantastic character. The way she's able to sort of dictate things around her, not with force, but with just her presence, was spectacular. She very much has control over Alan, even though she told him not to bother coming. Like, she definitely knew he would. And she has everyone afraid of her, that they can only stand up to her when they're not looking at her in the face. She's very resolute in shutting down the spring, and she doesn't care what other people think. She's made up her mind. She's not willing willing to listen to any opposing arguments. I think Marsh definitely sides with her, but she's also portrayed, as a little bit of a bully and insensitive at times. She's just outright mean to people, even though her intentions are good. No, the road to hell is paved with good intentions is Miss Pride personified here. Her intentions are good. She thinks the villagers are doing bad things by exploiting the poor and sick people. And yeah, there's a bit of elitism in her as she's viewing like the working class people of Port Caro as charlatans who don't know any better and they have no morals or scruples. But she's also right. The people of Port Caro are absolutely exploiting these people. But at the same time, she's not thinking of the people of Port Caro whose lives she's also ruining. I enjoyed her interactions with Alan, whom she clearly has affection for. And there's a good side to her. She doesn't want Wally to get in trouble and even wants to pay for his education. She says, like, even if Wally, is a murderer, let's like clear it up, let's cover it up. So, and she'll pay to send him to school somewhere. And she recognizes Wally as a victim. Like she realizes what's happening to Wally. She's just such a fascinating character, and there's a little bit of deadpan humor to her as well. Although I think it's unintentional on her part. Wally Traherne, another great character. I loved his story arc. He starts off as this despondent child who is teased by the other children because of his warts. He has no friends. He's just a sad, neglected little boy. And jump ahead 2 years, and he's the biggest celebrity in town, and he's obnoxious and spoiled. He is no longer a sympathetic character. He's a horrible little boy. Doesn't even remember Jenny, the only person who cared about him, and he's a victim. He's exploited by his father, by Mayor Nankerville. His mother is a drunk, and she basically plays no part in the story because she's always passed out drunk somewhere. So he's not getting a lot of like motherly love, and everyone involved in the Springs commercialization is also exploiting him. He goes around terrorizing those who threaten his status and threaten his money. He's being manipulated into doing this by his father and by Miss Cost and by Major Barrymore and these other people, but it's a fascinating storyline for him. Marsh does not hold back because he's a child. And yet, even in his spoiled form, I know he said he's not a sympathetic character, but the point is made, he's a tool. You do sort of feel bad for him because he doesn't know any better, and he's being manipulated into this brat and this nuisance because the adults need him to be that. He's their moneymaker, and he's an easy scapegoat to get rid of Miss Pride. And I don't think I mentioned it, but we actually do get a medical explanation as to what happened to his warts. What happened was the water in the springs was freezing cold, and freezing warts is a treatment method. I know they have those today. They have like those like freeze off cans or something. So when the warts were in the frozen water, they fell off, and when they were exposed to the water, and that's what happened to him. Jenny Williams was like, meh. I think we were supposed to like her a lot more than I did. There's nothing wrong with her. It's not like she's a bad character, but we've seen her archetype before in Niall Marsh, and I think Jenny is one of the less memorable and impactful of those like quasi outsider young women who Marsh uses to give her own thoughts in the absence of Agatha Troy. She does have a good bond with Miss Pride, which was nice, and her fights with Patrick were just sort of meh. It was just so obvious this was manufactured tension to create drama, and they were going to marry by the end of the novel. That wasn't really suspenseful to me. I also think Jenny was underutilized. This character usually plays at least something of like a quasi assistant to Alan when the likes of Fox isn't around, but Fox is around, so Jenny doesn't have much to do. And to be fair, she does help with Wally, which is something, but I still found her, fine. Squandered potential. She wasn't bad, but I don't think she was particularly great either. We have James Traherne, Wally's father, who was a good character. Another one of those like well depicted but unlikable creatures. He actually reminded me a lot of Homer Simpson, who obviously Homer Simpson is much more likable and loves his children, but it's in the way like Traherne constantly ruins everything and is just so short-sighted and ignorant. He can't see other people in the world. He constantly lies about things, including like where Wally was at the time of the murder, and his repeated threats to punish and beat Wally alert Alan to those lies because he knows his father would never harm his cash cow. It's not out of love for Wally he doesn't get beaten, it's for love of the money he doesn't get beaten. I know it's a big tell, And of course, the one time he's telling the truth, when he says he never saw Dr. Main that morning, he isn't believed for good reason. And that's a good example of a mystery author dragging the plot out, making it longer without it being contrived. I always say, like, even in the same book, I said how, the late arrival of Fox and Company was just like sort of manufactured to make the book last longer. This is a good way to do that. And Mr. Traherne, obviously a pretty big suspect, and one that I always considered sort of like on the lower end of the list. And he's very much like the blustering type that's always sort of like a red herring because they're actually a coward and aren't brave enough to commit a murder. Major Barrymore was a real piece of work. I actually liked him, even though he was just so unlikable. It was the way he didn't even pretend to believe in the Springs. He was just like, yep, I'm going to make money off of this. In a weird way, you are kind of rooting for him. That is until we learn he's possibly an abusive husband and all these other negative traits start coming to light. But I still found him a compelling character, a viable suspect, probably a little too obvious to actually be the murderer. He's definitely the central figure of life in Porcaro, and throughout the novel, you do get the sense that Porcaro will pull through in the end. The village will be fine, and removing Major Barrymore from that sort of disrupts the peace and framework of Porcaro in a way Niall Marsh wasn't likely to do. I did think Barrymore's interactions with Miss Pride were a lot of fun, and that he like basically first tried to bribe her, and when that didn't work, he just avoided her at every possible opportunity. And when he couldn't do that, he just like let her talk until she left. He's probably the only person in town with like a decent plan of action for dealing with Miss Pride. Having him having an affair with Miss Cost, I have to say that wasn't really convincing to me. It was necessary plot wise, but character wise, I didn't quite buy it. I mean, not that it was like totally outrageous, but still, I think there could have been a little bit of foreshadowing there. And Mrs. Barrymore I found less interesting as a character, but I think that's intentional, as she seems pretty generic for a long time and sort of like the wife of the inn proprietor, mother of Patrick. But I think this is done so the revelation that she's the Green Lady and that she's having an affair with Dr. Main come as more of a shock. And she's really the only person outside of Jenny who thinks commercializing the Springs is a bad idea. I mean, granted, she knows there was no Green Lady because she was the Green Lady, but I don't think that really influenced her decision. She's a very sympathetic character, and there's a real sense of fear she has of her husband, but at the same time, she does love him. And the whole business of her asking Allie not to tell her husband that he knows she's the Green Lady doesn't make a lot of sense if Major Barrymore already knows. And that is until you realize that she doesn't want her husband to dwell on that, because he's going to wonder why she was at the spring in the first place. He's too obsessed with the money to think about that, but he's going to catch on at some point if it keeps getting brought up. Like, she doesn't want her husband to keep thinking that she's the Green Lady, because he's going to think, why was she at the lake that day? It's because she was having an affair with Dr. Main, and that's why she doesn't want him to know. The Reverend and Mrs. Carstairs, Dulcie is her name. They're not like that major of a characters. I did find him fascinating a little bit. Niall Marsh often portrays religious people inconsistently across her novels. I mean, many of them are cult leader charlatans, like we see in like Death and Ecstasy, for instance. She does make a big point often of portraying religion in an unsavory way, yet other times she is very pro-religion and portrays religious people positively. Reverend Carstairs is sort of having it both ways here. He is absolutely using religion to his advantage. We're told multiple times that visitors to Porcaro donate a lot of money to the church restoration fund. Reverend Carstairs believes the springs do not have healing powers, and he voices this opinion very meekly, as if he's almost hoping someone will shoot it down, which they do. And he also lets himself be convinced the springs could be God's work. He's challenged by the others about whether he believes in miracles, and of course he does. He's a reverend. And there's a weakness to Reverend Carstairs that his wife does not possess. Mrs. Carstairs does not believe in the healing power of the springs and is more forceful in that belief, but she does play second fiddle to her husband. She's the Reverend's wife, and she's going to follow his lead. She's no Griselda Clement from Murder at the Vicarage. And there's a bit of like ignorance to her as well. I mean, she certainly talks a lot, and she talks about her dress from she got from Mrs. Barrymore and the necklace and all of these other things. Like she sort of like doesn't have the discretion to keep her mouth shut at times, and that does bother her husband a little bit. She does seem almost unaware of what's going on in town, as she's more dedicated to the church and her husband than the Springs. Patrick Farrier is a type we see a lot in murder mysteries, the impatient young man who's in love with a young lady. He doesn't really voice an opinion on pretty much anything that goes on, nor does he appear to be a real suspect. In universe, he's a suspect, but I don't think in the reader's mind he really is. He was in the novel a lot, but he doesn't like play any real role in the investigation or the mystery or the resolution. He provides like no clues, no insight into anything. I mean, we do have all that tension with Jenny, which I just didn't care for. I mean, I liked Patrick as a character. I mean, he seemed like a very likable, nice guy, and I thought he brought some minor comic relief moments, but he didn't have any real important parts. Certainly not as important as he appeared to be. I think he's probably one of the more, the bigger flops in the novel character-wise. And the final character to talk about is Mayor Ives Nankerville. What a wonderful name that is. I enjoyed him, and to me, he was the most humorous presence in this book outside of like all the Miss Pride critiquing people's French stuff. Mayor Nankerville is a complete scapegoat. I mean, we don't get any insight into how he became mayor, but it's so clear to me the smarter people just like Major Barrymore, like Miss Cost, just put him in that position because he's so easily manipulated, and that like he would be the one facing the brunt for Miss Pride, which doesn't actually happen to be fair. But he reminded me a lot of Mayor Sam Booth from Murder She Wrote, the proud do-nothing mayor who just performs ceremonial actions and has no real power to control things. I wish he was in the book more. I mean, his only substantial contribution to the mystery is providing Alan with all the gossip about Miss Cost and who she wanted to sleep with. I mean, the mayor clearly knows the gossip in town, and it appears the villagers may have chosen the wrong mayor if they thought he was going to be quiet. He clearly possesses information that he was supposed to be kept a secret, but because he's kind of a moron, he doesn't know it's supposed to be a secret. I thought he was a lot of fun, honestly. I liked him probably a lot more than I was supposed to. And that is it for this video. Let me know what you think of Deadwater in the comments below. I enjoyed my reread. Again, I did not find this a spectacular book by any means. Definitely a below average, but still passable Roderick Allen novel. It's not the bottom of the barrel. Next week, I will be diving once again into the titles of mystery novels, this time from non-Christie mystery writers. I did this topic with Agatha Christie, and I will now explore the titles of non-Christie authors, especially the ones I've already covered on this channel up to this date, which beginning of December 2024. I will do a little bit of like Sherlock Holmes as well, who I have not covered, but because I have a few to go through, this list would be a little less in depth than my Christie one was, but stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files.